nerds? Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Monday, February the 3rd, 2025, and today we're talking about a fascinating thing I've learned about tree leaves, big companies loving regenerative agriculture, and how farms cannot be contained, for better or worse. So let's do it. All right, well, hello, February, you short but mighty month, you. It's always odd when I have to say a new month, and now that January is over, I feel like this would be the time that I would say something like, I don't know, well, that month really flew by, but the weird thing is that I don't really feel that way very often anymore. Maybe I'm alone in this, but I've noticed as I get older and more confident and clear about the things I want to do in my life and have in my life, time doesn't really quote unquote fly like it used to. There for a while, it felt like months would just disappear, but it honestly doesn't feel that way anymore. Not sure how to articulate that, but January is officially over and I'm like, yeah, that went about the right speed. That's not totally a complete thought, but maybe someone has come to some similar realization and can give me better words for it. Anyway, it was a great weekend, if I don't at all mention how my sports teams did. I hope you all had fun. I worked on some landscaping. I mean, I call it landscaping, but it's really just cutting a few things back, piling them up for a future bonfire. And I knocked out a big chunk of my coaching plan for the season for the kiddos, because I certainly will not be able to do that while the spring is in swing. Also, this weekend, I caught up on some of the videos from the Native Habitat Project, which this group essentially works to educate people about native ecosystems as well as restore and protect them, primarily focused on the Southeast. And anyway, I came across this video that the host, Kyle, did about leaves a couple years back, and it was super fascinating. Essentially, in this video, Kyle lays out the case for how fire may be why certain trees drop or keep their leaves, as well as how the leaf shape and bark kind of played out through natural selection. All of this, Kyle argues, reflects the tree's relationship to fire. We've talked about fire on the show before and how important fire has been for basically all of human history and much of pre-human history, just perhaps not with the same frequency, leading up until the last 150 years or so when we mostly abandoned it, or at least abandoned it the scale we once used it on. It therefore stands to reason that different trees, who I should remind you cannot run away from fire, would have developed mechanisms for dealing with fires from lightning and then later more frequent fires from humans. But also Kyle makes the case that it goes one step beyond just being able to survive fires. Some trees that regularly drop their leaves could be doing so to encourage fire, which itself keeps the competition around them down, right? If you have fire at your feet, there's not going to be much that grows there, especially stuff that doesn't belong. In other words, the trees kind of want the fire, and they create leaves that encourage fire beneath them. He argues that this corresponds with the fire resistance of the tree. The trees that with thicker barks that do not tend to burn easily tend to create bigger leaves that are easier to burn and burn well, thus encouraging fire. The trees that have smooth barks and burn easily and don't typically grow in fire-prone areas often either have very thin leaves or needles or don't drop their leaves, or those trees do drop them, but they sink into the forest floor without a lot of air beneath them, air that would, in theory, promote more fire. Obviously, there are trees whose seeds require fire to burn, and we know how certain trees are more fire resistant than others. But I gotta be honest, I think the only explanation I've ever really heard for the ecological sort of purpose or value of trees dropping their leaves is for the recycling of nutrients, maybe saving energy, and maybe mulching out competition. It wouldn't make sense to keep leaves on if you're a tree in the winter if the cell walls of those leaves are just going to explode from the water they contain, freezing and then essentially killing the leaves. But I like this second possibility, or at least additional possibility, that it could also be a way to encourage fire, which fire was a very, very common thing all over the world for millennia that as a society we have moved away from for reasons I've explained before, but largely revolve around private land ownership and an underappreciation of the importance of fire on land and ecology. Anyway, it is worth watching that video or just any of their work. I really love what they're up to. To be clear, I don't know how other ecologists feel about this theory, and in fact, I would love to hear what other ecologists might say about that, about fire, about trees. I will listen to ecologists all day. They're wonderful. I find that stuff fascinating and obviously kind of part of the show. To me, with the leaf thing, it's a win-win for the trees who can either mulch the soil and get some of those nutrients back eventually, or who can feed some fire, which will encourage biodiversity and in some ways discourage invasives. Anyway, shouts to Kyle and the Native Habitat Project. What they're up to, I think, is awesome. I think restoring some of these native ecologies is extraordinarily important work and also very cool to watch as a nerd. They also work to raise awareness about new developments in sensitive ecological areas, which is something that deserves its own segment as well. At some point, we have to, at least in some regard, constrain cities because it is incredibly hard to reclaim ecologies once there are buildings and streets in the way. Anyway, interesting stuff all around. Up next, we'll take a Patreon question about agricultural labels like Regenerative and the corporations who love them. BRB.
Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show.
If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Joe Naaman Sessions, and this was from back in December. Quote, "Hi, Jesse. Thanks for the last month's effort you put into this pod. I've enjoyed listening to it daily while knocking out farm chores. I'll drop this here while waiting for the January thread to come up. I'd be curious on your thoughts on labels and practices and how can we differentiate small farms without our terms being co-opted by the big guys. I was ashamed to see larger swaths of DiGiorno pizza boxes saying how committed they are to regenerative agriculture, but in bold print at the bottom it says contains bioengineered products. One of these things is not like the other. Regenerative, ecological, organic, real organic, biodynamic, certified naturally grown, no-till. Is there a North Star to shoot for anymore?" End quote. All right, so thanks, Joe, and fun question. So indeed, it looks like some boxes of DiGiorno pizza, which is like, for those of you who don't know, it's just like a pizza you can buy in the frozen foods aisle of a grocery store here, at least in America. And it looks like some of those boxes do say DiGiorno loves regenerative agriculture on the back in a big, bold sidebar or whatever the pizza box version of the sidebar is. According to Nestle's website, who owns and produces DiGiorno, according to their website, announcing the use of more regeneratively farmed wheat in 2023. They write, quote, "This initiative will bring regenerative agriculture practices to over 40,000 hectares of farmland, the size of more than 53,000 football fields, and nearly double the amount of land needed to grow the wheat used in its DiGiorno pizzas." It goes on to say Nestle's investment will benefit wheat farms across Kansas, North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri. The work will help the company accelerate the transition to regenerative agriculture in its supply chains, end quote. I got to say, the first thing that stands out to me about this quote is that 40,000 hectares is actually more like 80,000 football fields at 0.5 hectares per field. The only way it's 53,000 is if they are using football fields as in soccer fields, which average closer to 0.72 hectares a piece, give or take, because soccer fields are not standardized. That, of course, has nothing to do with your question, but what does actually have to do with your question is that I believe bigger companies supporting farms that use these practices is good because it creates the market incentive for these farmers to start growing with more organic practices. Of course, bigger companies greenwashing or even watering down these practices is not great. It is when the market starts to see the value in something that a standardization must occur, where organizations have to set a standard and certification for what is and is not allowed to be called regenerative in this case. That is what we're seeing now with varying states and organizations working on definitions and offering certifications, but this term is not currently regulated. The certifying organizations largely use organic certification as a prerequisite for being regenerative, which would have strict regulations for labeling and using the term on a box. How do I feel about this on a DiGiorno box? Well, in a perfect world where we assume the products are actually being grown organically or better, I guess I'm in support of it vaguely. Demand creates supply, and more large farms having incentive and getting paid to grow organically / regeneratively is a good thing. 53,000 soccer fields of even vaguely better practices is a lot. So I'm good with that part. However, I think once the regulations come, we will hear less from Nestle and General Mills and others about their regenerative missions, and or we will see them a lot more involved in developing the regulatory part. But to your question of, is there a North Star to shoot for anymore? Well, as a consumer on a normal budget, a decent amount of awareness about what is happening behind the scenes will be required. The example you gave is pretty sneaky, but it's not possible in a better regulated world, assuming the regulations don't allow for products to use the term regenerative on a box for a product that contains genetically engineered ingredients or whatever. Like I said, I was surprised how many people found out from me that hydroponics can now be included in certified organic production. And there could be things like that in regenerative certifications as well that consumers should read up on if they truly care. But to be sure, it's unfair. Like, the position here sucks for the consumer. These things are very complicated to suss out. So as a consumer, it's not in your favor. As a farmer, well, I would suggest using the labels like marketing tools, but stick as best you can to your ecological principles and build good relationships with your customers. To be sure, although I don't agree with a lot of the technical construction of organic, it doesn't necessarily limit what one can do ecologically. It just neither encourages nor discourages it. And as I've said before, I'm all about Real Organic. I think they do a great job. They should run the show, the entire organic certification show, in my opinion. Being certified organic, however, doesn't make certain things easy. It doesn't promote or encourage what we all love about this job. And I would often find myself annoyed with the regulations, but I could, by and large, do what I wanted to do, ecologically speaking. So yeah, let your ecological principles be your North Star and use those labels as the tools that they are. Anyway, great question, and I expect some interesting comments on that, so please have at. Otherwise, a quick break, and then we'll talk about how farms travel, sorta. Yeah, be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by RX Soil. Curious if your soil will be ready for planting this spring? RX Soil can help you find out with their at-home soil test kits. They'll ship it right to your door. Just send it back, prepaid shipping, and you'll have your lab results in just 2 business days. Their reports are simple, with tailored seasonal recommendations for fertilizers and amendments. Order now at rxsoil.com and use code DAILY, DAILY, for 10% off. Begin your soil prep now for a great spring with RX Soil. All right, back to the show. Okay, so these last 2 topics sort of have me thinking about the idea of drift. Drift is the term that we usually use to describe what happens when an herbicide is sprayed at the wrong time and it drifts through the air and contaminates areas around its intended target. Natural woodlands, parks, or other farms, gardens, people, water, whatever it touches. But, and this is important, there are good drifts too. Now, I've discussed this in other videos a long time ago, but this idea of positive and negative drifts started for me when I was a much younger farmer living in the woods and managing a small garden with my wife, Hannah. I'd spent that day hauling manure from a neighbor's barn and loading up my small pickup truck. I would fill the truck by hand, drive about a mile or so back to my farm and unload it by hand. And in the side view mirror, I could see some of the manure blowing off of the truck bed all along the road. I was bemused watching some of my hard work blowing away, but also joking with my wife about how our neighbors were going to be pretty annoyed with me for making their lawn so productive that season. Then on my final load, I started to notice that some of the foliage in the woods near our house had a funny brown look to it. This particular road was shared, and it occurred to me that our neighbors, whom, to be clear, I loved dearly, were out spraying their soybeans with herbicide. This browning in the woods was drift. Effectively, the herbicide was drifting down into the woods and all along the tree line of their fields. But whereas the drift from our practices was going to make the the world around our farm healthier and more robust. This drift was just killing random plants and wildflowers in the woods, contaminating streams, just nothing good. And it started to occur to me that farms cannot be contained. No deed or fence row can stop the wind, stop the birds from flying through, the insects from landing, the weed seed, the water table, any of it. Then it spreads out into communities, on the food, in the wells, in the economy. And when you farm with death, like herbicides and pesticides, that is what spreads. But, and not to be corny here, but life spreads too. When you farm with life, healthy farms make other farms healthier. Good ecology begets more ecology across the fence row. If we're talking things like birds and monarch butterflies, that is work that spreads across the globe. Now, I'm not going to pretend I run a perfect farm. We use plastic tarps for weed control decreasingly, but we still use them, and those will one day end up in a landfill. I still drive gas-powered vehicles, use a fair amount of energy on our farm and in our home. I use a smartphone, a dumb computer, and those things drift negatively as well. That is, they do or will pollute environments and communities, but good drift is the goal. Good drift is what we're always working towards. Good drift is the North Star, as Joe described it in his question in the last segment. The things we do on our farm should make not only our customers healthier and ourselves healthier, but our communities and everything around us. And they will, because there is no way to contain the drift of life any more than there is to contain the negative drift, the drift of death, as we'll call it. To be clear, not all neighbors are going to care about the negative drift, nor necessarily welcome the positive drift. But the thing is, nature is never going to recognize our land deeds and surveys, ever. No matter what we do on our farms or in our gardens, it will drift, for better or worse. So the drift is unavoidable. We just have to choose which drift we will embrace. Anyway. Thoughts on that? Let me know. I'm going to wrap it up there. But before we go, I have to give one last shout out to the folks at Rimmel Greenhouse for making this show possible. And they've asked for me to live read this. So this should be an adventure every week for the month of February. So today's show is also brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses. Whether you're growing tomatoes for market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a high tunnel protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are strong, durable, and easy to assemble, offering the quality you need to grow productively year-round. The team of experts at Rimmel Greenhouse Systems will be your trusted partners to ensure you get exceptional value from your greenhouse or high tunnel investment. Visit Rimmel.com today to get growing. Huge shouts to all of our show sponsors. Shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Also shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music you hear here. Anyway, you're here. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up for the month of January, you will get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Leslie Wilger, Randall Duran, Lee Kossab, Pollinate Farm, Kendra Kelly, that's a bouncy name to say, I like it. Original Sen, I think it's Sen, but it's spelled C-Y-N, Original Sen. Farmer Z, and IB Taylor 123. Those are fun names today. In this story, this is a farm event, right? And it takes place over at Pollinate Farm. What happens is that everybody's hanging out. They're talking about the no-till systems, clearly, at Pollinate Farm. And suddenly they look up and there's a giant biodome being flown over by a bunch of helicopters, and it drops right on top of them. And it basically locks them in. And they effectively kind of have to figure out, one, why, but also two, how to survive. Is it safe out there? Like, did they lock us in to protect us? Will it work? It won't, because it takes them like an hour spoiler alert, it takes them like an hour to figure out how to dig out. But anyway, great story, very fun, great cameos, good stuff. Thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you tomorrow for Tuesday. It's my favorite. It's the second one. Thanks, and bye.